Welcome back, everyone. I'm the Bella Gamer, and today we're going to be talking about the class I'm most excited for in Starfinder 2nd Edition, which is the Solarion, which is the coolest class in either game, if I'm going to be honest, and one I'm incredibly hyped to talk to you all about. And in fact, if you're interested in Starfinder 2E playtest, it is currently available for free. I'm going to include a link to the where you can get it down in the description below. So go ahead and check it out there. But let's go ahead and talk about the Solarion. Why is the Solarion awesome? Well, it's kind of just the ultimate combat class in almost every way. Like, sure, it doesn't necessarily get as strong as the fighter as early, but if we're talking level 20, it's competitive, which is really cool. Now, the Solarion is Starfinder's more or less space paladin champion. Essentially, you have strong beliefs that kind of relate to the various cycles of a sun, whether it's when a sun radiates, which is the photon attuned state, or whether it collapses into a black hole, which is the graviton attuned state, or in the act of forming or after exploding, whatever, which is their unattuned state. So they have a very interesting lore. They're really cool. I do love the sunset colors when it comes to their iconic. It's so cool, but let's go ahead and take a look at what the class has to offer. So starting out, we have Expert in Perception, which is pretty good. We have Expert in Reflex and Will saves, and only trained in Fortitude, which is something that I'm actually surprised about. And oh, I forgot to mention. So this class is a 10 hit points per level class, and it has Strength as its key attribute, which is insane considering all the things you get to do with this particular class. And you're just going to want your strength to be high. Like every Solarion is going to want to have a really high strength because all the cool things you can do are essentially either based on your attack rolls or your class DC. So some important things to keep in mind. So going back to the core stats here, as far as skill proficiencies, we're trained in athletics and one or more determined by our stellar arrangement, which we'll talk about in a bit. And then an additional amount equal to 3 plus your intelligence modifier. Honestly, not too terrible. I've seen less and I've seen more, so it's pretty good. Now, they're trained in up to martial weapons, which is to be expected. It is a martial class. And they're trained only up into medium armor, though you can get up to heavy armor proficiencies if you select one of the early level feats. So if you want to go heavy armor, then there's definitely a route for you to take that. So let's talk about their Stellar Attunement, which is kind of their core class feature. So Stellar Attunement more or less boils down to what state you're attuned to, which tells you what abilities and how some of your abilities actually function. So one of the main things is your stellar arrangement, which again, we're going to talk about here immediately after this actually, will dictate what your standard state is, whether you're going to be in your graviton or photon or neutral state, which there is the balance arrangement, which is really good for being unattuned. You also gain access to the attune action. Now, you don't need to do this like Kineticists would at the start of your turn to get access to your abilities. You are just attuned to whatever your default is all the time when combat starts, unless you immediately had done something that would make you unattuned, which there are some actions that actually change your attunement after you use them. So the attunement action just lets you change to your preferred attunement, whatever that is. Now, they also have access to a unique exploration action called Attunement Control, which allows them to switch to their a different attunement rather than their preferred attunement if they have a decision to do so. There are some cases when doing this, mostly you're only going to use Attunement Control if you are the balanced arrangement because you're always unattuned, which means you won't have access to most of your solar manifestations, which that's actually the next feature we're going to talk about. So the solar manifestations are 3 core abilities that have a range, melee, and essentially defensive option for all Solarians, and you're going to be using these as your primary weapons, essentially, as you level up. So first off, we'll talk about Solar Flare. This is a mote of energy that floats around you, and it deals damage based on the kind of attunement you're currently in. It's a singular action. You make a range strike against the AC of a target using your strength modifier to the damage roll. So this is great because essentially we get automatic propulsive with this action. Now you still need dex because it's still a ranged attack, but it still more or less is going to be based on your strength as far as the damage is concerned. So even just a few points of dex, it gives you a decent range option. Or if you want to go the strange only solar shot build, then you can really do so, and every point of strength you have just increases your damage, which is pretty cool. Now, based on your attunement, you get extra effects. If you're graviton attuned, you do an additional D8 D8 bludgeoning damage per damage die, which these damage die do increase every 4 levels you have. So at 5, 9, 13, 17, we're going to see these increases. That's pretty standard, and that follows the same rate of increase that weapons typically do for getting additional damage die. So essentially, it's a ranged weapon that automatically heightens. Pretty cool. Now, on a critical success, you can attempt to trip the target using your athletics, even if you don't have a free hand or are not adjacent to him. Essentially, you're laying him out flat with your solar shot, which is really good and also enhances the use of strength with solar shot. And we also have Photon Attune. This one does a D6 fire damage, has a range of 30 feet, double the range of our Graviton shot. And on critical success, they take a D6 persistent fire damage. Now, one thing I'm a little upset about is that this D6 doesn't seem to increase as the damage goes on, though it does say the damage increased by 1d6. So that might include both of them. I feel like they need to errata this because it should increase with your base damage die if you want it to be anywhere useful in the late game, because a D6 persistent is kind of nice, but it's going to be overall meaningless against the sheer amount of HP enemies have. So if that D6 increases, and it's on a critical, so I mean, come on, I feel like that should necessarily increase. The second manifestation they have is their Solar Nimbus. This is kind of like a layer of armor they have, and mostly what this lies in is when you get struck as a reaction, you can trigger your Nimbus, which does something different based on what attunement you are. Now, you do need to take damage from a melee attack specifically. So this isn't a all-the-time defense for any kind of situation. But if you're Graviton attuned, the creature striking you must make a fort save against your class DC or be pushed 5 feet away from you. I wish there was a crit effect here that said if they crit fail, they are pushed 10 feet away from you. Feels appropriate. And with Photon attuned, the creature takes fire damage equal to half your level, round up. Or this one's not even based on a save, so the enemy will just always take damage. Now, this is something that I think is really good as a reaction right out the gate. Rather than like a champion does, where you get to defend other people, this one mostly just does things to enemies who hurt you, making the Solarion not a support class. Even though they have similar themes, they don't have like a god or anything. They're kind of like Jedi. Solarians are mostly like Jedi in a way. Only there's not good and evil or dark and light. It's just graviton, photon, what state of the cycle you're in, more or less. So I love Nimbus Surge. I especially love it for photon, to be honest, even though graviton is my favorite. Photons is really good, as you just always are dealing extra fire damage. Pretty much at least once per round whenever an enemy hits you with a melee strike, which seems really good. Though I gotta state, in Starfinder specifically, range combat prevails a lot more frequently, so you're not going to always get access to hitting them, which I feel like makes Nimbus Surge not as good in Starfinder, but it's really good in Pathfinder. So if you have some crossover, this is insanely powerful in Pathfinder. Now, the third manifestation is Solar Weapon. Now, your Solar Weapon is a weapon that you get to manifest that you treat as a martial weapon for the sake of proficiencies. Now, it deals a D8 of your choice of either bludgeoning, piercing, or slashing damage, and you get to choose up to 2 traits, or you can trade those 2 traits for the reach trait if you decide. So this little table here, you get 2 of these traits, or you get reach, whichever you prefer. Now, you also get to select what weapon group your solar weapon is, and you can change any part of this with the Reforged Solar Weapon action, which is a 10-minute activity, meaning you can have whatever weapon you prefer at any given moment, which is pretty cool. Now, if you're concerned that there's not any special mention here about, any hand wraps and mighty blows or anything to improve your solar weapon, well, your solar weapon is actually based on a Solarion weapon crystal, which essentially is just like, it's just what you use for the sake of runes that you would put on a weapon anyway. So you don't need to necessarily worry about that. They have that kind of covered in the setting, though that does mean that you do need to actively invest money to improve your Solarion weapon, which does make sense and keeps it more or less balanced. What's especially cool about this is that there are unique crystals that you can use that do essentially the same thing as property runes, which is also really sick. So honestly, overall, this is pretty cool. And based on what attunement you are, changes what happens when you successfully strike an enemy with your solar weapon. So if you're gravity attunes, the creature treats all squares when they're struck as being difficult terrain that are immediately adjacent to them. Meaning that if they want to move, they have to immediately spend 10 feet of their movement to move in any direction, which is pretty devastating. Now, with Photon Attune, whenever you strike, you deal an additional amount of damage, which is fire damage, equal to half your level rounded up. So overall, the Solarion just has really good weapons and a kit almost right out the gate. Now, of course, you do need a Solarion weapon that you start with, obviously, but still being able to change what traits your weapon has, what type of weapon group your weapon uses, because we do get crit specialization, does mean that the Solarion is always able to adjust their playstyle to their preferred. So if you want to really tune up your particular playstyle, Solarion is definitely going to be for you. So let's go ahead and talk about the Solarion arrangements, because this is going to be the core aspect of what attunement essentially you're going to want to stay in as much as possible, because most of your abilities are going to be based on more or less that. I'm not going to go over each of them, but I'm going to go over my favorite one, which is Degradant, so you can see what the Solarion arrangement have to offer. So first of all, the Degradant, you become trained in Deception or Intimidation as your arrangement skill. And your favorite attunement is Graviton, which is my favorite, which is why we're talking about it. So whenever you enter combat, unless you're using the attunement control exploration action, you're always going to start off in your Graviton state, which is really good, especially because we also gain access to our initial revelation. So our initial revelation for Degradant is Black Hole. It's a 2-action ability that we can use once per 10 minutes. And it has some unique traits. It has attuned, which means you must be attuned to either side in order to use this one, and cycle. So what the cycle trait does is when we use this one, we switch after we use the ability. So not before, but after we use the ability, we switch to the opposite attunement. So we'll swap from either Graviton to Photon or Photon to Graviton. There is one that will swap us to unattuned, but that's a different one called Disharmony, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So with Black Hole, you have to be Gravitune attuned, which means that during combat, granted, we only need to use this one once per combat, but we do need to make sure that we have any other Graviton abilities. We have to switch back to Graviton afterwards. But when we use this one, we select any number of creatures within a 30-foot radius of our character, and each one must takes a D8 bludgeoning damage based on a basic fortitude saving throw, essentially. That has some additional effects. Now, if they crit succeed, nothing happens. They don't take damage. If they succeed, they take half damage and are pulled 5 feet towards you. And if they fail, they take the full damage and are pulled 15 feet towards you and are knocked prone. And if they crit fail, they take double the damage. They're pulled 30 feet towards you, which is essentially your max range, and are knocked prone. And this ability does heighten every 2 levels. So essentially at every odd level, this is going to increase by another D8. That's a really incredible ability. Now, we only get to use this essentially once per combat, but that's still really good. I really do like this ability. Its ability to pull enemies out of cover or whatever. There's so many interesting ways that you can use this one specifically. And because it all does bludgeoning damage, There might even be some types of enemies who are particularly weak to this, which Graviton is mostly dealing bludgeoning damage, so it stays more or less in line. Now, moving on, when we hit 9th level, we get Defy Gravity. Now, this is just anytime we're attuned to Graviton, we have a fly speed equal to our land speed, which is really good. So you have to be careful, though, because if you use Black Hole, you're going to swap attunements, which is going to stop you from flying, which means you might immediately fall. So you do need to be careful, but the fact that anytime, pretty much all the time, we can fly, unless for whatever reason we've changed our attunements, which is an incredibly solid ability to just get automatically as a class. Now, our final or a greater revelation we get at level 15, and this is Singularity. Now, we can only use this one once per hour. It's 3 actions, and it requires you to be Graviton attuned, as obvious by the abilities. You manifest a black hole somewhere within 60 feet of you. This occupies a single 5-foot space. Any creatures within the Singularity space takes 10d8 void damage based on a basic reflex saving throw against your class DC, and any creatures that are dropped to 0 hit points are ripped asunder and pulled into the Singularity, leaving no remains. That's pretty metal. Now, until the end of your next turn, the Singularity space and all adjacent spaces count as supernatural darkness that no creature, even those with greater dark vision, can see through, as it's a black hole and it's pulling in all light. And creatures beginning their round within the area of darkness must succeed on a basic fortitude saving throw against your class DC or become slowed 1 for that round. And every odd level after this increases by an additional 2d8. So the biggest part about this one is you select a creature, essentially, and you try to pull them into a black hole. They make a basic reflex saving throw. Success or fail, they'll take damage or no damage. But then they're going to have to make a basic fort save or become automatically slowed. So even if they crit succeed the reflex save, they could fail the fort save and become slowed 1. I wish there was a crit fail here where they could become slowed 2, but what have you, it doesn't really matter. It's a really powerful ability. You just get to manifest a black hole at any point. It's insanely cool. Now, as far as class features are concerned, we see many of the same things that we get. As I mentioned before, we do get crit specialization with our solar weapon specifically at level 5, which is pretty cool. And somewhat similar to a fighter, we do get a bonus +2 circumstance bonus at level 7 to our perception checks when we're rolling perception for initiative. And this does stack with incredible initiative, making it well, I shouldn't say stack, but it increases it to +3 instead, which is actually pretty cool. But the most insane part about Solarion, and why I said that they're pretty much on par with Fighter, is at level 19, they become legendary when using their solar weapon, along with making our class CC Master. That means we get legendary proficiency with another class when using pretty much any kind of weapon, because you can turn your solar weapon into almost any kind of weapon, barring some special circumstances. So overall, already a powerful class. And they got some stellar feats too. Now, I'm not going to go over each of the feats. You can definitely check out the link below if you're interested in checking out the playtest. But I'm going to share some of my favorites, mostly those around the Solar Shield feat you can get at level 1. So Solar Shield is an additional manifestation similar to like our solar weapon that we can use. And so when we're attuned, we have this energy shield that we can raise with that gives us a +1 circumstance bonus to our AC. It kind of acts like a buckler. You don't need a free hand. It's just a small shield that kind of floats around us that we can expand essentially with an action to defend ourselves with. Now, we also get the shield block reaction when using this shield specifically, so we don't need to even pick up the feat in order to do so, which is pretty cool. Now, the shield doesn't innately have hardness, but there are certain things that happen when the shield either gets broken or based on our attunement that works with the shield. Now, kind of similar to how the shield cantrip works. If it breaks, we can't use it again for 10 minutes. But we can shield block until it breaks up until that point, which is pretty cool. Now, for Graviton attuned, the shield has hardness equal to half of our level rounded up, which is pretty good. Actually, I really like that one. But Photon is even cooler because if the shield becomes destroyed, any adjacent enemies must make a fort save against your class DC or be dazzled one for a round. On a crit failure, they're instead blinded for a round. That's really good. And there's actually some really good benefits, as we're going to see with some later feats here, to having our shield break. So Photon and Graviton, I feel like both have good uses. Now, our shield has an amount of HP equal to 5 plus twice our level. So whatever that is. It's not a lot of HP, admittedly, which makes it easier to break. Great for Photon, but for Graviton, it's mostly like once or twice per combat you can reduce the damage by half your level rounded up, which is still pretty good. And if you're not using the Nimbus reaction, this is a better reaction in my eye, especially if you're going Graviton focused, because you might not want to push an enemy away from you, for instance. So I really like Solar Shield. Now, at level 6, we actually get an increase to this one with Nimbus Block. Now, this affects the Nimbus reaction, but also it works with Solar Shield in the sense that whenever we use the Shield Block reaction with the Solar Shield against a melee attack, which I guess isn't always necessary, but what we get to do is we can use the Nimbus Surge in addition to the shield block reaction, essentially combining the two, allowing us to get extra hardness if we're Graviton, for instance, and pushing the enemy away, which might force them to move again to become adjacent to you. Or if we're going Photon, we can dazzle and burn them with the Nimbus block, which is really, really cool. So I really like this. It enhances our ability and doesn't just force us to pick one of our two reactions in this situation. And finally, as a later game feat, we get Stellar Shield Collapse. Now, this is a free action that's triggered whenever our Solar Shield is destroyed while we have it currently raised, obviously probably through the shield block reaction. And it has a requirement that we haven't used either Black Hole or Supernova within the last 10 minutes. Now, if you remember, Black Hole was that ability that pulled a lot of people in towards us when we used it, and it did a bunch of bludgeoning damage. So as a reaction, we could use this free action to deal a bunch of damage to the enemy, pull them into us, and get some extra action efficiency. Now, this will swap you out of your cycle, and I believe Supernova also has this cycle trait as well. So this is just a really good setup. This is already like kind of a shield build, and I'm really digging it. It really creates an interesting choice, and especially if you go Degradant and you're going Graviton focused, a ranged person shooting you and like destroying your shield is an incredibly bad thing, because you might just pull them into them, dealing a bunch of damage, which is really cool. So the Solarion is my favorite class in Starfinder 2nd Edition, and honestly, it's definitely in contention to be one of my favorite classes in all of the Paizoverse for their 2E editions. I want to see what they do with the full release, but Solarion feels incredibly solid already, so I'd be incredibly surprised if they did anything else with this. So, that being said, that's why the Solarion is awesome. Now, like I said, if you are interested in seeing more about the Solarion, check out the link down below. And hey, while you're down there, leave this video a like. In fact, if you see anyone else making Starfinder 2E content, please check out their videos, leave their videos a like. The more people we get watching and liking Starfinder content, the more Starfinder gets out in the algorithm, and I want to see more people talking about Starfinder in general. So I think that would be really cool. And hey, if you like my content specifically, subscribe. I'm covering all things tabletop, and especially Paizo-related content like Starfinder 2E and Pathfinder 2E. And we still have so many crazy announcements and other cool books coming out this month. So if you don't want to miss any of that, I recommend subscribing. But that's going to be it for me. Thank you all so much for watching. Good luck with your games. Leave the bad luck to me, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye.